Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Vern Bengtson, who is here visiting us from the University of Southern California, where he is professor in the School of Social Work there. But before that, had held an AARP University chair and was for many years part of the Andrus Center there on gerontology. Dr. Bengtson is a past president of the Gerontological Society of America, among many other prestigious posts and awards, and a kind of living legend, if you'll allow me to say that, in the field
of
in the field of gerontology and theories of aging, and the sociology of aging, and in family sociology. You'll see in his presentation today how all of those strands of his work kind of have come together in a brand new way. He's going to base his talk today on a brand new book called Families and Faith: How Religion is Passed Down Across Generations, with Oxford University Press. And again, it's my honor to welcome him as a collaborator, as a friend, and as a mentor. And we all feel delighted to have you in our presence today. So, Vern, please.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. It's not my first visit to Oregon State. This university has a long and distinguished history in many ways, but one of them is the Conference on Aging that's been held here for many years, and I've been invited here twice to participate in that. But also over the years, I've had many colleagues and friends that have come from here in this program. Alexis Walker was a special friend of mine. Of course, Karen Hooker and Carolyn Aldwin have been colleagues over the years whose work I have admired and respected. Alan Aycock, who's sitting back there, trying to
hear the troublemaker.
He and I worked together on the longitudinal study of generations, the data from which I'm going to talk about today, in the 1970s when the study just began. And I owe him a great debt of gratitude for the design and some of the statistical sophistication of that study. And he and I put together a paper which was published in the Journal of Marriage and the Family about mothers versus fathers' influence on children. And that was awarded the Reuben Hill Prize from the National Council on Family Relations. And I've always cherished that. It's still cited today, by the way, in publications. So, Guru, Genius, Obi Kenobi. It's good to see you again. And then there's, of course, Rich Sutterston, who I've known for quite a while now and whose work I've always admired. He's a polymath. He knows an awful lot about an awful lot of aspects of not only adulthood and aging, but also adolescence and aging. And the whole lifespan. His interest in theory has taken him to many different branches of issues of adult development and aging. And his handbook of the sociology of aging is, of course, one of the best resources internationally regarded in the field of aging, with some really up-to-date and informative perspectives, theoretical perspectives on the lifespan as it has to do with aging, and not just the aged. And for so many years, the field of gerontology, especially in the social sciences, has suffered from a preoccupation of the aged, ignoring the fact that the aged get there by a process of aging. So thank you so much for all the inspiration that you've given to me. And thank you for working me so desperately hard the last 2 days, not giving me a chance to sleep more than a few hours a night in the handbook of theories of aging that we're putting together. Today I want to talk about families and aging, And I'll start by introducing you to my great-great-grandparents. This is Carl and Sophia Johansson, a photograph taken in their living room in Hudne, Västergötland, Sweden. And this is a room that I visited just 11 months ago. I didn't take this picture then, but it's a house next to a mill, and the property is still in my family in Sweden. And you'll notice the book that's open in the lap of my great-great-grandfather Carl. That is the family Bible, which came into the family in 1846. Family lore has it that the father of Carl traded 6 months' wages for that precious Bible. And this is an indication of a new religious movement that swept through Northern Europe at that time, the Pietistic Revival movement. They were fervent evangelicals. What I want to talk about today are millennials and generational differences, social change, and the crisis of family values that, according to some people, we find ourselves in today. Parents' influence on religious values. What do the data show? Non-religious families and value transmission. The unexpected influence of grandparents. Life cycle trajectories of religion. These are all topics that not much has been written on, except in the popular media, where it is largely supposed that religion is dying out in America, and especially it's dying out because of generational differences. You read the headlines in last week's newspapers. Millennials are leaving the church in droves. There's a crisis in America. Religion is on the decline in the United States. Well, we'll talk about whether these things are true. Millennials and generational differences is the place where we'll start. And this is Carl Johansson's family. He had 9 children. 6 of them emigrated to America. Imagine yourself as a parent seeing that 2/3 of your children leave and you never see them again the rest of your life or their lives. That's what happened. Imagine also if you had a particular set of values that were terribly important to you and you wanted to pass them on, and they left and you never saw them again. How lasting would be your influence on your children's values? Well, Carl Johansson's influence was significant. All of those 6 that emigrated carried that Swedish evangelical mission-oriented tradition into Iowa, Minnesota, and Kansas, and joined churches there of like-minded evangelicals. That's my grandmother, who is in the front row on the right, and she was one of those who left. Millennials are different from their elders, as we see in a lot of polls. They're more liberal, less conservative than their elders. More believe that illegal immigrants should receive citizenship, for example. Many more agree that same-sex couples should be given the legal rights of marriage just like everybody else. They're more racially diverse than older generations. They're more likely to vote or identify as Democrats. 51% of millennials identify with the Democratic Party versus, for example, 39% of those in the so-called silent generation who were born up until 1944. In religion, too, we see contrasts. Fewer millennials are affiliated with religious groups. You see a figure of anywhere from 33 to 37% of millennials being not associated with any religious organization and in part depends on the sample and the age range of the respondent. But in general, 1/3 compared to only 18% of those who are older claim no religious affiliation. But it's interesting, and this gets to another part of the story that I want to get into. What does it mean to be religious? Ask about church affiliation, you can ask about church attendance, and then you can ask about belief in God. They're not that different in the percentage who believe in God to their elders. But they are different if you ask about spirituality. More millennials than any other group say, well, I'm not religious, but I am spiritual. So there are differences. And these are the data that were released last week that created such an impact in the mass media. Here you see the difference between generations, but also the difference in just 7 years in the way in which people responded to a survey asking whether they had religious affiliation or not. You see here that the silent generation in 2007, those born up until 1945, only 9% of them in 2007 reported they had no religious affiliation. 14% of baby boomers, 19% of Generation Xers, and 25% of older millennials reported no religious affiliation. In 2014, just 7 years later, figures were all up, but up to 34% of millennials in the younger age group and 36% of older millennials. So this table purports to tell two stories. And I'll put these in the sensationalist terms in which they were reported in the mass media. Number one, there's a generational trend in which Americans are becoming less and less religious. Number two, there's an age gap in religiosity. There's a generational gap in terms of younger people being less and less religious. Okay, so you see the two pictures? America is moving downward in religion, and there's an age cleavage in religion. Okay, you see the two different stories?
I like that dance.
Thank you. So, millennials, therefore, are leaving the church in droves, right? Wait a minute. We've got a sample of millennials in 2007 and a sample of millennials in 2014. That doesn't mean millennials are leaving the church. It just means you sampled two different groups of people. See, this is what social scientists should always say to journalists. Wait a minute, your interpretation of the data. Americans who consider themselves Christian has left 8%. That means America is becoming less religious. Wait a minute. Does church attendance equate to religiosity? So how significant are these differences? To what extent is there a generation gap in values and behavior pertaining to religion? Our families, because this is the other underlying theme of these headlines. Families are not passing on their religion. These data show that young people are abandoning their parents' faith. Well, let's get then to the issue of social change, because that's part of what this grand story is. And this is a picture of a family that's in the midst of social change. This is my great-great-grandfather, and my grandfather and my grandmother. My grandfather is standing on the left. He's a young man. This is family solidarity in Sweden during harvest time. The whole family gathers together. The family was an economic unit. It was a working unit. It was also a religious unit. They all went to church on time. It was the educational unit because there were not any schools in rural Sweden. The family performed many, many functions that families do not perform today. And some observers in the early 20th century suggested, like Ernest Burgess, who was briefly my professor at the University of Chicago, suggested that because the family had undergone so much change in the face of modernity, it had lost its functions. What's really interesting is that some sociologists in the late 20th century were saying exactly the same thing. David Popenoe, a demographer, family demographer at the University of Texas, Austin, published a paper in the Journal of Marriage and the Family in 1992, saying once again that the family was in decline because it had lost all its functions. He pointed the finger to divorce. He also said there was a family values crisis in American society. He didn't say that in his Journal of Marriage and Family article. He did say that in the Council of American Family Values piece, a group that some of you are probably familiar with. Here's the other picture that the Pew Report gives. It shows how much Christian religions, organized religious bodies, have lost in just 7 years, and how much those who say no religion, non-affiliation, the non-affiliated individual population has increased. And you can see there that Catholics have declined in membership, mainline Protestants have declined in membership, the unaffiliated have increased, non-Christian faiths have slightly increased. The message for Catholics is that it's even worse than it looks because American Catholicism among whites has plummeted. These figures do not show that because immigration from Mexico, from South America, has swelled the ranks of otherwise almost vacant pews. And the vacancies in the non-Sunbelt states are enormous. For mainline Protestants, the Presbyterian Church, the Methodist Church, to a lesser extent the Episcopal Church, the United Church of Christ, those membership declines were steep in the 1980s and 1990s, leveled off in the 2000s. Now they appear to be going down once again. So, religion is on the decline. Is religion on the decline? Or are those who bother to join a church on the decline? Does church membership mean what it did in 1950? Does church attendance mean what it did in 1950? What's happened in the last 50 years? We've had enormous changes in public respect for social institutions such as the church, in cultural values such as an increase in individualism. You all know about Robert Putnam's book, Bowling Alone. How many of you know what that means? Okay, I'll tell a story then. Robert Putnam did essentially an ethnography of a town in Indiana in the 1970s, early 1970s, I think it was. And one of the things he observed is that much of the social interaction, much of the social cohesion of this small farm town occurred because of the bowling leagues in that town. There's a large new bowling alley, and they had leagues bowling every night of the week except Sunday, because that was the Sabbath. So this was just a huge source of social integration in the 1970s. He went back to the small town early in the 1990s, And he went to the bowling alley. He saw one bowler bowling alone. What had happened? Well, the town had lost population. But people were also not bowling. Leagues had ceased to exist. People were sitting at home watching TV. He suggested this reflected the cultural shift away from collectivism and toward individualism in American society. Whether that's an exaggeration, you can judge for yourself. But it certainly makes the point of social change. Cultural values change. In families, of course, lower marriage rates. Comparing 1970 to 2005, more single mother households, fewer fathers around, increase? No. The existence of gay marriage, which did not occur in 1970 when our study began. All those things have caused the family to take on new forms. And of course, this has led to a perception of a crisis in families. Families are losing their traditional forms and functions. This is a quote from that Journal of Marriage and the Family paper by David Popenoe. It was actually 1997, not 1992. Traditional values are declining in importance. Increase in religious nuns. Youth are rejecting their parents' values. 35% of those millennia have no religious affiliation. In America, we're experiencing a serious generational gap in values. So that, it's so bad, that in America, we need a day of prayer and fasting to repent the decline in family values. This was spoken by an American presidential candidate. He is a candidate this year. You can guess who he is? No, you can't, because there are 4 or 5 or 6 candidates that would say it. But in this case, he happened to give this speech in May, and he happens to be the governor of the state of Texas. Nevertheless, America is one of the most religious countries across the globe. 92% of us, according to a 2012 poll, say that we believe a God exists. This compares to those godless Brits and the Swedes are impossible. 72% say they pray almost daily. 56% say religion is very important in their lives. So there's this paradox. Is the glass half empty or half full if you're a religious leader in America? But anyway, what does this have to do with values? Families are where kids learn values. Well, they learn values from the media, from the peers, from the schools. But the family gets there first. And even in our fast-moving individualistic culture, there still is consensus that families should be imparting the notion of right and wrong, good and bad, to their kids. So, are they? We designed this study, like Rick suggested, in an attempt to find out the degree to which there appeared to be transmission, or the extent to which we could see lack of transmission between generations in family values, values that were important to parents and families. And I was blown away by what happened. I was awakened on a Saturday in February by the telephone. That was a call from my cousin in Minneapolis. And he said, "Hey, Vern, you made the Wall Street Journal." I said, "What do you mean? What have I done?" "Yeah, there's a big article about your book. It takes up, the whole page, and it's a column and a half wide. And of course, I rushed right out after getting on my pajamas and bought every copy I could find. It's hard in Santa Barbara to find a copy of the Wall Street Journal at 7 o'clock in the morning. And here it was. Mothers and fathers often throw up their hands and let popular culture take over, but parents have greater moral and religious influence than they think. That's not a quote from me, that was a quote from the reviewer. And I thought, my gosh, geez, I never expected this to happen. If I got something in contemporary gerontology or the gerontologist as a review, I would have been happy at Wall Street Journal. Following Friday, my neighbor said, "Hey, Vern, do you take the New York Times?" I said, "No, I'm limited to the New Los Angeles Times because they report the scores of USC football." Although I've almost decided to drop my subscription fortunes the last few years. Parental bonds prove more important than their practices or their piety in passing on religious values. What was it that made the findings in this book create so much public interest? What did the data show about families that could make the gimlet-eyed, bottom-line oriented editors of the Wall Street Journal think that somebody would want to pick up a book about families, religion, and generations that didn't have a single dollar sign anywhere in the book? Well, there must be some kind of a hunger out there, even among accountants and junk bond dealers, about family transmission and values and what's good and what is bad in the transmission process. So now's the time to tell you about the methods of the study, and I chose this picture because often graduate students feel that methods are like the dark, drizzly, dour months of December. This is the mill. This is the house on your right, where the picture is taken earlier, and this is the year that they emigrated to America. Studying families and time, we've used the longitudinal study of generations that Alan helped to launch. We used a mixed methods approach with survey data collected over 8 waves and in-depth interviews that we collected in 2005 to 2008. So the quantitative data, 8 waves, 356 multi-generational families were in the sample. Started in 1971, there were 2,000 individuals that were members of these 300 or 400 families. By 2005, we picked up the 4th generation, the great-grandchildren of the original grandparents as they turned 16. And so the number there was 1776 because of the deaths of the oldest generation and the second oldest generation. We picked our sample from the Kaiser Medical Group in Southern and Central California, 840,000 members. And I can tell you a little bit about that if you want to learn more about that. It is not a nationally representative sample, which in 2015 is a fatal flaw in design, but which in 1969, would have cost about $35 million to launch, because that was back in the day before we had random digit long distance dialing, and you have no idea how expensive it would have been to go house to house in every state in the nation to say, "Do you have a 3-generation family? Can we interview you?" And then it would have been impossible. So we have a cohort sequential design where we have, for example, the grandparent and grandchild, G1 and G3, in 1970, and we have the G2 and G4, grandparent, grandchild, in 2005. And so we can follow that, we can compare them at 2 points in time. They're about the same age, but they're different cohorts. Qualitative data, in-depth interviews. We pulled out a sample of 25 families from the 300 or so families in the larger panel. We were able to interview 6 of the original G1s. Our oldest respondent was 97, I think, and she sat through an hour and a half interview with pauses for water. She was wonderful. And we could link the generations together to get a case study of the whole family across generations. And that's what most of the book is. It's qualitative case studies of families and of intergenerational relationships where there was and there was not evidence of transmission. So we wanted to find out how much influence did we find intergenerationally on values? How much has this changed in the 3.5 decades since we started gathering data? Are grandparents of much influence? Could we find evidence that there was cross-generational influence around 3 and then 4 generations? And how about change over the life course? With 35 years of data, we can follow the same individuals over their life course in terms of values, attitudes, and behavior. Intergenerational continuity. In 1910, my great-grandmother with my grandfather came to America, and in the doorway there, the woman holding the little baby is my grandmother, and the little baby is my father. And this whole troop, 9 people, came to America in the hull of a smelly migrant boat and landed in the middle of Minnesota, where they had been promised that the streets were paved with gold and there was a fortune waiting every Swede. All they had to do was dig a little bit for it. It was in the middle of winter. My grandfather couldn't wait to get to America. The snow drifts were that high, and they were living in the upstairs 2-bedroom farmhouse. 9 people. Intergenerational continuity in the context of social change. It somehow survived. So here are 4 findings from the data. 5. What our data indicated, we expected to find a generation gap in religious values. Why? Because there's been so much social change, and because we all know that parents aren't as relevant as they used to be. These are standardized coefficients, and anytime a sociologist sees a standardized coefficient between 2 groups that is higher than 0.2, he or she gets excited. These standardized coefficients are much higher than 0.2, and they suggest that there is significant similarity on these 4 dimensions of religiosity between the parents in our sample and the children in our sample. And these are matched parent-child dyads. Religious intensity is a variable that's indexed by items such as how religious would you say you are? Very religious, somewhat religious, not very religious, not at all religious. So you could have a score of high correlation if both parent and child said they were very religious, or that both parent and child said they were not religious. So this is not a high religiosity scale. So, high parent-child agreement. And then the fifth measure had to do with religious affiliation. Are you a Baptist? Is your father a Baptist? There we found lower similarity scores. How about comparing over time? We were surprised that we did not find a decline in intergenerational transmission over time. And this shows the comparison between the two time periods. Only in religious affiliation was there a decline between 1970 and the year 2005. So what predicts high similarity or transmission? What accounts for low similarity transmission? Well, in traditional socialization models, the first and most important thing is role modeling, right? A second thing is explicit tuition. So role modeling, you do things that your child will follow you in. Explicit tuition, you teach them the things. In religion, you've got to not only take them to church, you've got to be in church yourself. You've got to lead your child in prayers at home. Second, you have to teach them about the Bible. You have to teach them about your church traditions. Right? That's what you hear from the pulpit. No. We found that emotional bonds were more important than either of those two things. Particularly important was the father. Look at the difference in similarity scores between the relationships that were judged as close by the child and those that were not. The factor is almost one of twice as much similarity. Here's another way to look at it. This is these are the trajectories of high closeness, high parent-child closeness. And I don't have a graph here, but then we looked at gender differences, and we found that closeness, the perception of closeness attributed by the child to the parent, we also call this solidarity, did not make a significant difference on the part of the mother. In other words, whether the mother was perceived as close or distant was not statistically a predictor of high or low similarity. But for the father, difference was amazing. So, if you want to have your child follow you in values, and your father is not sufficient, if you are a deacon and preach every third Sunday, and if you lead Bible study in your own home, if you're a cold, authoritarian, Old Testament, patriarchal type dad, chances are you're not going to be successful in your socialization. What about the religious nuns? Where do the non-religious millennials in this story that you have heard about last week come from? This is my other great-grandfather. His name is Sven, and he did not follow the other side of the family into this religious fervor. Here he is in his 70s. He's a cheerful old atheist. And he had cheerful atheist children. So when I visit Sweden, I've got one side of evangelicals to visit and another side of atheists to visit. And it's really interesting to bounce back and forth between them. Well, we hear the assumption, especially in interpretations of the data last week, that the non-religious millennials are rebelling against their parents. They are discarding what their parents taught them. They're never going to return. So we looked at this. We looked at how non-religious children come about. And it's really interesting to think of, and many of you in this room are in this situation or have been. How do you teach your children moral and ethical values without a Sunday school to rely on, without a youth group to rely on, without the Bible, without the sacraments, without this whole institutional mechanism that your Christian neighbors have? very interesting sociological question. Well, here's where the religious nuns come from. This is the degree of parent-child similarity for different denominations, different religious groups. And the black is 2005. The gray is 1970. And what you can see is that in each group, except for the Jews and the Mormons, and they're a very small group, there has been a decline in the degree of parent-child similarity, except among the nuns. And that's a huge increase over 35 years in the degree of parent-child similarity. That's very suggestive. When you also look at the percent of unaffiliated young adults whose parents are nuns, this is really interesting. Now, it could be argued that, well, that's just a matter of chance. It's not the fact that there is any socialization going on. It's just a matter of religious indifference on the part of both generations. And that's why we looked in depth in our interviews to see what was going on in those families. And what we found was intense descriptions of how the non-religious parents attempted to pass on their strong beliefs in right and wrong, in good and bad, to their children, in the absence of these institutional parameters that were available to the religious parents. How about grandparents? This is my grandfather and grandmother. They carried on the evangelical tradition. We've got to look beyond the nuclear family. That's what our pollster friends and our politicians are still focused on. But what we see here is that there is a statistically significant degree of similarity and influence. And even more surprising, the degree of influence has not changed over the period of time of this study. How about this life course effect? I introduce you to Carl Johansson's great-great-great-grandson, who happens to be my grandson. And he, like Carl Johansson, is a fervent evangelical. He and my daughter live in the buckle of the Bible Belt of California, which is Temecula. And they go to a Missouri Synod Lutheran church there, which is very fervently evangelical. Of course, he's also a fervent Swede. That's the Swedish flag. There's family traditions. Now, this is only because we have this cohort sequential design, can we trace long-term longitudinal patterns of religiosity, as well as cohort patterns. So here you have each of our cohorts, G1, G2, G3, G4, as we have been able to measure them across time. And I won't spend much time on this, just kind of keep this. But here's sort of the life course pattern that we're building. Following age 18 is this downward. That's what this poll was picking up, millennials dropping out of organized religion. But our data don't focus on just church membership. They include these other 4 variables, so we have a much more nuanced picture. Then, after age 28 or so, add about that, this says tick upward. Then there's a spike upward in the 30s. Then there's a plateau through middle age. And then there's a slight curve upward about age 70. And then there's a pronounced curve upward in the last years. 2 messages here. 3. Number 1, there's a life course to religiosity, which is almost completely ignored by pollsters. is change. People don't stay the same. Number two, there's a high probability that people who drop out of a strong religious faith will return to it. Because that's what our data show. Not everybody. Number three, if you just look at cross-sectional data, you lose the story. Because change over time in terms of looking at cohorts is not the same as development over time looking at individuals. So, is there a crisis in family values today? I don't think so. I think family bonds and family influences are strong. I think multi-generational bonds, as I argued in a 2002 piece in Journal of Marriage and Family, are stronger than ever before in American history. And that's because we have longer years of shared lives between children, grandchildren, and probably because families are more involved, grandparents are more involved than they have been ever before. There's an article in today's USA Today about this. I'll get into it in the question and answer session if you're interested. Is there a generation gap in values like religion today? Well, there's substantial generational similarities. There are differences. But to say there's a gap, that there's something that can't be bridged. The polls about these religious nuns equate religion with church membership. And churches are changing. And a lot of people who say they have no religious affiliation are actually religious seekers. They haven't chosen a church. They may not ever choose a church, but that doesn't mean they're not religious or spiritual. Are parents failing to pass on values? I don't think so. And equality is really important if you're a parent and you want to see your children benefit from the hard lessons that you learned in life about what's the most important thing in life, and what's good, and what's value, and what's beautiful. Are grandparents relevant? Well, I'm preaching to the choir here because you all know what they are. So, families matter. Thank you.
Great. So thank you for finishing with 10 full minutes at least of Q&A, which is terrific. This is a group that loves to ask questions, and good questions. So let's just go ahead and open it up. Who'd like to start? Come on now, don't let me down. Rob.
Excellent. Very much enjoyed this. I'm actually quite curious. You showed the what would you say, the sociologist's dream slide with standardized estimates above 0.2, and kind of talking about the on diagonals and representing that there is this strong sort of similarity. I'm wondering if you've been able to dig into the data in terms of those off diagonals where there's an incongruence between the dyads and such, and how has that helped shape your thinking and inform what we know about this intergenerational transmission?
Okay, I'm so glad you asked that question, because not only is it profound, it also allows me to make I'll just be blatant about it. I need help. If there's anybody here who wants to help me, like, hi Al, if there's anybody here who would like to help me look at the data and examine this, I would appreciate it, because it's a complicated question, and I don't have the tools Nor do I have the graduate students right now in the new position I'm in the School of Social Work to address it. The thing that I have focused on is the qualitative data. And I do have case study materials where I can talk about that. And there's a chapter in the book about religious rebels. And they're very interesting. And why people fall away from the faith is very interesting. And just a real brief example, there's a Mormon kid whose name is Austin. In his questionnaire in 1992, he talked about how he was looking forward to his mission. His dad, he is a descendant of Brigham Young. His dad was very, very prominent in the church. We interviewed him in 2005. He was no longer Mormon, and we asked why. And he gave the story that he went on his mission. He had what he called a nervous breakdown. It was actually a psychotic episode. He asked to be sent home. The bishop in the mission said, no, you've got a commitment. He went home anyway. His dad was absolutely furious. He said, you have committed to God. He said, I couldn't handle it. He said, I had to leave. He married a non-Mormon. He was excommunicated from the church. His mother stood by him. His father will not talk to him. Now that's an example of a father who was a role model, who taught everything, and it was cold. Okay? That's an example of the outlier. Okay? Now that's just a case study. But with sufficient statistical sophistication, I think, you tease out those kinds of examples.
Excellent. Another question. Monica?
I'm interested in knowing, when you looked at the different family configurations, such as single mothers or other family configurations than the nuclear mother-father with kids, what kind of data did you find examining the religious affiliation or religiosity with those families?
Do you have an example? I mean, what are you thinking of? Divorce or?
Sure.
Yeah, okay. Well, we have one chapter that examines two dimensions. One is families in which, of quote, mixed marriage, in terms of where there was a difference in the denomination or the faith at the time of marriage. And then the second was a breakup in the marriage. In both cases, there was lower rates of transmission. And that's the statistical part. That's the survey part. Everybody knows that. Okay, so now the fun part is to look at the qualitative data. And story after story about how these things are negotiated and who follows who, you know. And for me to give any generalization about that, of patterns, I can't do it. I can't see it. Just so many individual differences, you know. So I can't answer your question very usefully.
Did you have families that were maybe a second or third generation immigrant? Were
No.
the children reared differently than their parents?
No, our sample was stable blue-collar families in Southern California.
So I guess in line with Monica's question, my name's Katie, and I was wondering if you have families who started with a nuclear family and then maybe the current generation has maybe the single mom, the dad's not in the picture, and then the child is now older. And what are those are the families that you're saying that when the father is not in the picture that wasn't true?
No, I'm saying about the cold father.
Well, I mean, what if the father isn't even around? Like, there's no father.
Father absent.
So that means cold father.
That's really cold.
In the first place, our analysis started out at a dyadic level. So what we're talking about in that case is the mother's influence on the child. And then we went to the triadic level, and so we then separated, okay, here are the triadic families, and then here are the dyadic families. In many cases where the father was absent, we didn't have any data. So we couldn't make those comparisons.
Heidi?
Sort of related to all this,
Why do you think that there wasn't much influence of the quality of mother? Do you have a thought about that?
Yeah, that's the opposite side of the question is how on earth could we find that the fathers were so influential when everybody knows the fathers are irrelevant? Most people don't ask the question in quite that offensive a way, but yeah. I didn't mean that you did. I don't exactly know, except that at Columbia University last fall, there was a rabbi in the room who had the courage to stand up and say, there's something about religion that is male-oriented. He said, I don't mean to be sexist about this, but every major religion in the world has had a male figure as the head, rightly or wrongly. And he says, I happen to believe in Jung's archetypes. And, you know. So, and then somebody sitting beside him, a woman, said, yeah, but it may be that fathers are so irrelevant in so many other ways in the family that this is the only way that they shine. And everybody laughed. So I don't know. I really don't know. These socialization, the socialization theories, they both drop out. Type 4, they both convert to become Baptists. All kinds of combinations of that. We didn't have enough data to parse out all those dimensions. And when we did it on gender lines, it got messed up because then the issue of divorce also came up, and we gotta do that. So I don't know.
Thank you.
I don't know.
Okay.
Can I tell you one story that's really interesting? This is about grandparents. We came up with 4 patterns of grandparent influence that we could find. And one was the grandparents reinforcing the parents' influence, there was similarity. A second was grandparents, the generation, what do you call it? Boing. Skips generation influence. The third was the grandparents.
I like boing ching boing.
The grandparents subverting the parents' influence. Okay, here's the Goldbergs. They're devout Jews. They have a son. His name is James. He goes awry. He marries a fundamentalist. Marriage doesn't last, but they've got 2 kids. Okay, so here are these Jewish grandparents, fundamentalist daughter, ex-daughter-in-law, 2 kids. The kids come and spend every holiday with their grandparents. The grandparents take them and try to teach them Jewish laws and Jewish theology. Mom picks them up. She takes them home, sits them down, and tells them all this stuff's wrong. We interviewed one of the boys. He tells us a story. Okay, what are the boys? They're evangelicals. Now that's an example of mixed faith and the negotiation of that mixed faith across 3 generations. So you see how complicated it is.
Yeah. When you were talking about religiosity as a life course, and I was looking at the slides, it appeared to me that religiosity increased during critical developmental points, marriage, children, near death. Did any of your qualitative interviews talk about why people may have become more religious at those points?
Well, this is one of those tragedies of being a researcher. You always find out stuff after you've gathered your data that you wish you had known before. If I'd had any inkling of that, I would have said, hey, do some prompts for that. So the next research project is going to be exactly that. Religious development in later life. Why some people increase, why some people stay the same. And I'm absolutely fascinated by the issue of how and why some people in their later years drop out of religion or do like Job was asked to do, curse God and die. Anybody would like to help me in that? I'd like some graduate students to do a presentation here. Thank you, Rick.
Excellent. Thanks so much. So.